welcoming Ed Colby.
Thanks, Phoebe. Can you guys hear me okay? I really love to tell stories, and I'll tell you a few here tonight. And seeing that mountain lion, this is a good naturalist. It has nothing to do with honeybees. But my gal Marilyn and I, we raise lambs. We get bum lambs. A bum lamb is a lamb that doesn't have a mother for some reason. Either she doesn't have the maternal instinct, or she's died, or for whatever reason she can't produce milk. So we get these lambs and we raise them, and we eat them in the fall. But a couple of summers ago, a mountain lion came down and killed all of them. And it's the most remarkable thing to see. If you see a mountain lion kill, you'll never forget it, because they disembowel them. And they ate part of them, and a couple of them they just killed. But seeing that majestic lamb killer over there made me think of that. My boss, when I came to work, I gave this talk in Carbondale last night. And my boss, when I came to work, said, because he knew I was getting off early to get down to Carbondale, he said, so your talk is the history of honeybees? And I said, no, Art, it's about pesticides in honeybees. And he goes, well, that would be the history of honeybees. So Jim Kravitz asked me to do this talk, and I did a similar one 3 years ago. Which focused more on colony collapse disorder, which I will touch upon here. But we know so much more now than we did 3 years ago. And this is so controversial in the scientific and beekeeping world. There is nothing cut and dried about this. I didn't even really know where I stood on it when I started researching it about a month ago. In fact, I wanted to back out entirely. Well, not back out, but I wanted to just tell Jim, no, I don't have time for this. But my gal Marilyn said, no, you need to do this. Not just for ACEs, but for yourself. And the deeper I dug, the more surprises I came upon, because nothing is quite as simple as it seems at the outset. A little bit about myself. I'm what they call a sideline beekeeper. This is so much more than a hobby, but still something short of a livelihood. I take care of about 100 hives of bees. And I write what passes for a humor and human interest column for Bee Culture magazine. But I also touch on some serious issues there as well. And I just want to tell you one great story. It has nothing to do with neonicotinoids, but it does have something to do with bees. And I think it could only happen in Aspen. A few summers ago, I was working as a ranger up on Aspen Mountain in the summer. Think ski patrol, but no skis. So I'm handing out Band-Aids and talking to people and trying to meet all the ACEs girls. My boss, Carolyn, comes to me and says, Ed, and I was keeping honeybees on Aspen Mountain at that time. I'm not anymore, but that's okay. It was still pretty accurate. But anyhow, my boss Carolyn comes to me and says, Ed, you're interested in bees. Why don't you give a weekly talk on honeybees? And I said, sure, I can do that. So first day, it's set for 11 o'clock in the morning. I'm waiting there in the patrol room for people to show up, and nobody shows up. And it gets to be 11:15, it's 11:20. And I'm thinking, well, there's just really no interest in this. When this family arrives, and the man is about 55 years old, he's a good-looking guy. His wife is an attractive woman, I would say of 45, a couple of teenage daughters, and they walk in, and she comes up to me, and in slightly accented, but really grammatically perfect English, she says to me, my husband is the president of the Brotherhood of the Ukrainian Beekeepers. And I looked at this guy, And I recognize this guy. And some of you would recognize this guy. Because do you remember in 2004, there was a presidential election in Ukraine, and one of the candidates, Viktor Yushchenko, got poisoned. He got poisoned by dioxin, and he developed a condition called chloracne, where basically his face broke out in pustules, and it's pretty clear that it was done by Russian agents who were backing his opponent, Viktor Yanukovych. Okay, so they had the election in 2004, and Viktor Yanukovych, the Russian-backed candidate, supposedly won the election, but every exit poll said that Viktor Yushchenko won the election. So this was when the Ukrainian people poured out into the streets in what they called the Orange Revolution, and the Supreme Court decided that there needed to be a re-election. They nullified the first election. They had a re-election, and Viktor Yushchenko won. And I knew that Viktor Yushchenko was a beekeeper. So he and I, two beekeepers, and basically no audience other than his wife, who translated for him. He doesn't speak English. So we sat down for an hour, and I told him about beekeeping in Colorado. He told me about beekeeping in Ukraine, that has a very long tradition of beekeeping. And then he said, the big international bee conference, Apimondia, is happening in 2013. This is in 2011. He said, why don't you come? I said, well, I don't know if I can afford to come. I mean, it sounds like a great idea. And his wife, Katya, said, well, I'll give you my personal email. Write to me, and I'll find you a place to sleep, was the way she put it. So in 2013, my gal Marilyn and I got on a plane. We flew to Kiev. We were met by a guy in a dark suit who put us in a giant limousine and drove us to a penthouse apartment next to this ancient St. Sophia Cathedral. And we were basically guests of the Yushchenkos for about 2.5 weeks. And he's a good cook. If you have preconceptions about neonicotinoids, I hope to change them. Not necessarily one way or the other. You'll see what I mean. I don't expect that I'll be as controversial as the Wolf Lady. Did the Wolf Lady speak here or only in Carbondale? Did the ranchers come here too? Oh yeah, we got an earful there. Okay, if you take just one thing away from this, let it be this. Honeybees are fundamentally different from other pollinators in the way that they react to pesticides. And I'll explain how that is. Little history on colony collapse disorder. A big commercial beekeeper named Dave Hackenberg in Pennsylvania, his bees got wiped out by a strange malady in 2006, where 80% of his hives, virtually all the bees disappeared, leaving behind queen bee, nurse bees taking care of the brood, but basically all the foragers disappeared. And this is the weirdest thing of all. This hive was avoided. Normally when a hive dies, other bees will go in there and rob honey, unless there's a lot of nectar available. Bees wouldn't do that, and predators stayed away from it. They've never gotten to the bottom, and this happened to other beekeepers, and it happened over a period of several years. It appears to be over now, and it appears to parallel the mysterious disappearances of bees that have happened over some hundreds of years that we have records of. But I'm here to tell you, it's hard to keep bees alive. The queens don't lay, the hives don't build up. It's when you say that bees are weakened or they're dying, it's like people. It's like if there's an epidemic. Okay, there's an epidemic of Ebola in Africa, but not everybody got it. The people who got it got really sick and maybe died, but more people didn't get it. and seem to do just fine. And that's the way it is with bees. It's not that they're all weaker. I have hives that are tremendous hives, but it seems like more and more there are hives, they can't make it through the winter. Sometimes they can't make it through the summer. All the experts agree on not much, but they do agree on this. The main stressors on honeybees are parasites, particularly the varroa mite. If you can think of a critter that looks like a tick, it's reddish in color, it's as big as a dinner plate, and it lived on your back and chewed on you, that'll give you an idea of the kind of stress that honeybees are under from these varroa mites. Diseases, there's a new disease that has jumped species from Asia, from the Asian honeybee, called Nosema ceranae, that's very hard on bees. But this is also related to those varroa mites, because we now know that the varroa mites, the wounds that they create on bees are the vectors, the entry for disease. So just as if you were covered with sores, they might get infected. Same thing with honeybees. And we find that especially viruses that have been with honeybees for a long time and didn't used to be a problem are now killing and weakening hives. Nutrition is huge. Commercial beekeepers basically put their bees on monoculture. And okay, what's something that's really good for you? How about spinach? Spinach is a really good thing to eat for a lot of reasons. But if all you ate was spinach, maybe you wouldn't be quite so healthy. So bees that are, say, that are going into the almonds right now to pollinate the almonds, that's big business for commercial beekeepers. That's the only flower in sight, is the almond flower. So while almond pollen is actually very nutritious, but it's still not a balanced diet. And pesticides. And when they do studies of bees that are in agricultural areas, they come up with, you wouldn't believe the list of pesticides, fungicides, organophosphates, pyrethroids that are in pollen. But the one that stands out and the one that has been receiving the most attention lately is a class of insecticides called neonicotinoids. Think about that word, neonicotinoid, nicotine. It mimics the action of nicotine in affecting the nervous system of these plants. And if you belong to any environmental organization, they've all got your address, and your mailbox has been filled with pamphlets beseeching you to help save the bees because the neonicotinoids are killing them. These toxins are basically applied in 3 different ways. They put it in the ground. They use foliar sprays. Think of crop dusters or sprayers being towed behind tractors. But most cleverly, or maybe insidiously, I don't know, is that they dip the seed for annual plants, like corn. Corn's a good example, or canola, or soybeans. These are annual plants. So in the spring when they plant, they dip the seed in this pesticide, and it expresses itself throughout the plant. So that chewing insects that bite on this plant are killed, but it also expresses itself all the way into the flowers, the nectar, and the pollen, where extremely small amounts are found. Unfortunately for honeybees and other pollinators, a little bit of this stuff goes a long ways. It's extremely toxic to honeybees and other pollinators. The upside to this is low toxicity for mammals. It's it's a lot safer than a lot of other pesticides for us. And to a large extent, the farmers are not calling in the crop dusters anymore because these seeds are pre-treated to be pesticide resistant. So you have GMO crops that are Roundup ready, meaning that you can spray Roundup herbicide on the plants. Doesn't hurt them because they're genetically engineered not to react to this herbicide that kills broadleaf plants. So you get the weeds killed, but the plant, the crop is not affected. On top of that, they've been treated with neonicotinoids so that they're not bothered by cutworms or wireworms or the white grub or any of those other pests of, say, corn. A study by the U.S. Geological Survey, a series of studies in 2014 and 15, documented neonicotinoids. I'm going to start calling them the neonics because if you want to impress people, if you're in the know, you just call them the neonics. The environmentalists call them the neonics. I do too. They documented these in half the waterways they tested in the U.S. and Puerto Rico, and in the Midwest, in the Corn Belt, there were really high levels of neonicotinoids. And not only that, but like nicotine, the neonics appear to actually be addictive. What they did in a study in Britain was they fed honeybees syrup that was basically sugar water, and that was sugar water with neonicotinoid added to it. And I don't think they put very much in because it didn't kill the bees. And there wasn't any apparent difference in taste, but they found that the bees kept going back to the syrup that had the neonicotinoids in it. So, okay, so now I've told you all this really bad stuff, and now I'm going to tell you something that just totally blows my mind, and that is that honeybees are thriving in the Corn Belt. And there's a guy named Randy Oliver who's a really smart guy, and he's in the neonics are fine, they're better than the alternative camp. And I was looking through the people who are his donors, and one of them is the Illinois Beekeeping Association. So what's going on here? And this is where my research became interesting. Okay, so among the best and the brightest, there are differences of opinion. There are shrill voices. And I know people who don't speak to each other used to be friends because they're on opposite sides of this issue. But the first big splash came in the New York Times in 2012 when an environmental researcher at Harvard named Chen Sheng Liu put out a paper purporting to show that if you fed honeybees neonicotinoids, it would kill them. This was a non-peer-reviewed paper that appeared in a very obscure journal. The New York Times got a hold of this, and I don't know whether they put it on the front page, but it was a big splash. And this paper has since been ridiculed. And the criticism is that basically Chen Sheng Liu fed these honeybees neonics and they didn't die. So he fed them some more and they didn't die. And he fed them some more and they didn't die. And finally he gave them a really whopping dose and they died. So that really, I think, is where the environmental movement, pretty much hard on the heels of that, became a big supporter of banning neonicotinoids. But I want to focus here on some bee researchers who I either know personally or I know by reputation, and they have no axe to grind, and listening carefully to what they say. Dennis Van Engelsdorp at the University of Maryland, whom Marilyn and I heard speak at the Apomondia conference in Kiev, concluded, I am not convinced that neonicotinoids are a major driver of colony loss, but he thinks fungicides are, and they're not getting any mainstream press at all. The patron saint of beekeepers, of course, is Marla Spivak at the University of Minnesota, where she is a teacher, research scientist, a MacArthur Fellow. She thinks that the key thing is nutrition. And she cites a study of one of her doctoral students where this student followed the bees of a number of commercial beekeepers who took their bees between North Dakota and California. So basically, California in the winter for the almonds, and sunflowers and canola and all that stuff in North Dakota in the summer. She found that the bees that did the best were the ones who were on the best forage. And it just so happens that those bees, through analysis of pollen, had the most pesticide residues. Strongest bees had the most pesticides. And she found practically no, her researcher, her student, found practically no neonicotinoids in the pollen. Big news that just came out this month that I thought was very interesting was that the EPA came up with a report draft, and they tested a neonicotinoid called Imidacloprid, and they found that on a number of different crops, and they found if there were more than 25 parts per billion, think about that, that's not very much. If there was more than 25 parts per billion of imidacloprid in pollen, that honeybees suffered or died. But if there was less, they did fine. And there didn't seem to be any middle ground. It was right at 25. They went from no effect to killing bees. This is on honeybees. So the conclusion of the report was that imidacloprid was an acceptable pesticide to use on most vegetables, on berries, tobacco, corn. That's the big one. 80 million acres of corn. 80% of those seeds have been dipped in imidacloprid. But they found that it was harmful on cotton and citrus. So this was the first, I thought, really good research that I ran into that indicated that maybe there is some harm from this at certain levels, and maybe it's safe at certain other levels. And they also said that new uses of neonicotinoids will no longer be approved, at least for a while here. So we're not going to start, there aren't going to be any new uses for it. And there are further studies to follow this year on the 3 other chief neonicotinoid pesticides. And then they said something that was really sad, and I really didn't like it. And it shows to me that either the EPA is not paying attention, or they don't get it, or they're corrupt. I don't know. But they said that honeybees are a good surrogate for all pollinators, and they are not. Here's how it works. Here is how honeybee larvae get fed. When young adult bees, being nurse worker bees, when they receive copious quantities of a wide variety of good pollen, they develop a fatty blood protein in their head called vitellogenin. And so they have this stuff in their head, and then these nurse bees consume pollen, and they feed it to the larvae. Think of it as regurgitation, if you'd like, but it gets detoxified by the vitellogenin. And this is miraculous and wonderful, I think. But the bad news is that it's only honeybees that do it. So bumblebees and all of our 4,000 species of wild bees in this country, what happens there is the queen bee lays an egg on a grain of pollen, the egg hatches, and the larva consumes the pollen directly. So they don't have this filtering effect. And here's where the cascade of bad news comes in. A government-sponsored study at Lund University in Sweden, they studied clothianidin on canola, or rape, and they determined that it had no impact on honeybees, but it retarded the growth and reproduction of bumblebees, and that wild bees basically disappeared. A French study showed that trace amounts of neonicotinoid impaired bumblebee production by 85%, and we see that bumblebee numbers are declining worldwide. A researcher at the University of Minnesota determined that imidacloprid harms monarch butterfly larvae. So there's three really popular species. We got honeybees, the little darling honeybees. We got the furry friendly bumblebees, the iconic monarch. They're getting some studies done about them. But how about this almost infinity of other pollinators? Where's the money, where's the time, where's the energy researching this? So what I'm saying is, I think that the environmental community is barking up the wrong tree when they talk about honeybees disappearing. It appears to me they're killing everything but the honeybees. There's a lot of talk in farming about integrated pest management. And in the best sense of the word, it means that the farmer does the smartest, best, less intrusive thing to guarantee a crop. So if you've got corn and you got cutworms, you do the least harmful thing, maybe the most cost-effective thing that you can to control those cutworms to the point where there's a balance. In other words, you're willing to take some economic loss, but you're also saving money by not dumping pesticides on your crops. And it seems to me that the problem with the neonicotinoids is that you're not waiting to find out if you have a problem. You're putting a pesticide on the seed that expresses itself in the plant that kills insects, whether they're a problem or not. I have just to give you a perfect example, I face the same dilemma with varroa mites. There are times I need to treat these varroa mites, and I use chemicals to do it. Not always, but sometimes I have to. And I hate to say it, there are beekeepers that just put that stuff in twice a year, and they use it until the mites become resistant to it, and then they try to find something else. What I try to do, and what I think is a responsible thing for beekeepers to do, is to monitor those mites, and that's a lot of work. But through ways that I can go into a hive, and in just a few minutes, I can get a rough idea of the percentage of bees that have mites. So then I can treat those hives. Or, maybe I'll be looking at 40 hives and I might check 6 of them and the numbers are all off the chart, in which case I might have to treat the whole yard. But a lot of times I don't have to treat it all. You can't do that with neonicotinoids. And the USDA came out with a report that on soybeans, they're either treating for pests that aren't a problem or they're ineffective. And insects have become resistant to some of the neonicotinoids already. They've only been around since the 1990s. But we don't live in a vacuum. And farmers sometimes need pesticides, American farmers, if they're going to feed the world. Even organic farmers use pesticides. Cobra venom would be an organic insecticide. And we need to consider that banning the neonicotinoids could bring back the crop dusters, the pyrethroids, the organophosphates, which are known killers of honeybees. So there aren't easy answers here. I'm very encouraged that the EPA seems to be taking this seriously, with the one caveat I talked about not seeming to face up to the fact that honeybees aren't the same as other pollinators. But for an agricultural issue, there's unprecedented political pressure. When I get those pamphlets like from the National Resources Defense Fund, I sign them. And I'm not sure what the answer is, and I'm not sure that the answer is completely banning the neonicotinoids, but what I like is it keeps the issue out there. Because it is something that we need to talk about. We need some of our pesticides, and I think we need all of our pollinators. And President Obama has appointed a pollinator task force. And I'm optimistic that we can make some headway here. And with that, I'll take my first question.
This doesn't actually amplify your voice, but it's just so that we can record all the questions. So if anyone has a question, I'm going to pass this around to you.
I have a couple of hives up here in Aspen.
Good for you.
Near Meadowood, near the hospital. And I like to think that because there's no commercial agriculture near here, that I don't have some of the pesticide issues, and also there aren't too many kept bees up here to kind of spread different diseases. And so while I like to think that, do you think that? And also, how much of these pesticides and whatever make their way into the honey product itself?
I don't. The biggest, the greatest number of pesticides are not coming from farmers. They're coming from beekeepers. They're coming from beekeepers controlling their varroa mites. And there are trace amounts of this that are coming into honey. But I don't think it's a serious problem. The responsible beekeepers do this when they don't have honey supers on the hive. And the rule of thumb is you wait 30 days. But there's no question that a lot of pesticides, including the pesticides that beekeepers use, are being absorbed into the wax. So there can't help but be some contamination. As far as pests, boy, unless you live in a really, really remote place, which this is not, there are two kinds of beekeepers. There are beekeepers who have varroa mites, and there's beekeepers who will have varroa mites. And I would strongly encourage you to The best thing to do is to go to scientificbeekeeping.com. And that's that guy I was telling you about, Randy Oliver, who's the naysayer on the neonicotinoids. But boy, has he got good information on environmentally responsible ways to control varroa mites and also to test for them. And you could also take Derek Manick's class down in Silt in the summer. He's a commercial beekeeper. He's a young guy. He's a really smart kid, and he knows so much. He has classes every Saturday. And I could give you my card, and we could write his name on it if you wanted.
Thank you so much. I'm curious if so this pesticide is typically applied by applying to the seed and letting it just kind of propagate throughout the plant.
On annuals, it is, yeah.
On annuals.
Yeah.
So is it effective as a topical kind of a spray pesticide? Because it seems like if the goal is it is. So does that work its way into the plant at all? Because it seems like the goal is to control munching, not pollinating animals. So a topical spray, does that affect the pollen as much?
I don't know the answer to that.
Sorry.
I mean, anytime you're spraying around bloom, you're certainly running into problems with contamination of pollen. But the idea when you're spraying is to not spray any time around bloom. So farmers are always dancing around this issue of killing the pest and not killing the bees. Yep.
Hi, Ed. That was a great talk. Well, my question is, I was going to ask you about the history of neonics, but you said the 1990s when they kind of came into fashion in the U.S.
Right.
And now you have this great Ukraine connection. What's the situation in other countries? Are they using neonics? Are they behind?
There's a 2-year ban in the EU on neonicotinoids, and I just found out like 2 nights ago that they have expanded it. They have extended it until August of 2017. There's a lot of conflicting reports about what's actually happened over there. It doesn't appear that honeybees have rebounded. It looks like they were stabilizing anyhow, and they appear to still be stabilizing. But they have extended the ban, and some of the farmers are complaining that they're getting hit really hard by pests. And in the UK, they just made an exemption to save farmers in a certain area who were being wiped out by some kind of a canola pest. They just gave them an exemption so that they can use some neonicotinoid insecticides in that particular region in Britain.
And those honeybees are the same as ours? Are they a different species?
Say again, my ears aren't that good.
Are those honeybees the same as the North American honeybee, or are they?
Yeah, basically honeybee, what I call honeybees are of European or Asian origin, and there are many subspecies, and they tend to be a little bit different in England, but they certainly could cross with our bees.
You had mentioned that one of your researchers said that there was a nutrition issue, and you also brought up the fact that you need balanced nutrition, not monoculture nutrition, but then you also said that bees in the cornlands are thriving, so which is, a total monoculture. So can you talk about this nutritional issue?
I don't really know the answer to that, because and you're absolutely correct. With the big boom in corn production, boy, Marilyn and I took a trip on the train through the Midwest, and there's not much there that isn't corn. But clearly, they do have places, and I don't know enough about beekeeping in the Midwest to know what those locations are, because corn is essentially wind pollinated, although bees do visit corn. But they evidently have locations. There's soybeans back there. They like soybean blossoms.
But those bees in those areas are, as you said, happy, thriving. relatively speaking.
Yeah, I know that from secondhand reports, and I also know it from the fact that the Illinois Beekeepers Association is supporting this naysayer who he has a really comprehensive website with lots of beekeeping information, and he solicits contributions from people.
He's a neonic naysayer.
Yeah. He lives in California.
So ultimately, basically your talk just threw everything up in the air and we still have no idea. Is that what you said?
Absolutely.
Okay. Don't walk out of here thinking you know what's going on. Is that what you're saying?
I'm saying take everything with a grain of salt, and let's find a solution to this. I'm not sure you and I can do it, but we can certainly know what we know, and we can know what we don't know. Is that clear as mud?
Totally.
Any other questions?
That was really informative. I appreciate your time. This is a little more light question, but do you have any good bee jokes?
Do I? Boy, you really put me on the spot there now. I don't think I do. I can't think of one. You should have tipped me off. I could have looked one up for you. If I'd have known you were coming. Okay, thanks a million.
Well, thank you so much, Ed, for coming and presenting. Really great presentation, and thank you for the questions. And I'm sure that if you have another question, you can come up and ask Ed. But thank you so much for coming, and maybe hopefully we'll see you next week.